Hey everyone, welcome back. In this section of our discussion on AWS Code Deploy, we're going to go through a short demonstration. Before we dive into the demo, there is a lot of setup that went into getting to the point where I'm able to show you a deployment to an EC2 instance. The first thing I did was set up the permissions that would need to be used by the different resources. In this case, both the instance and the code deploy service needed to be given specific permissions through IAM roles in order to perform their necessary functions. For the instance, it needed permissions to access the repository destination, which is S3 in this case, and needed to be able to make calls to code deploy. The reasons these permissions are needed is because the code deploy agent on the instances needs to be able to call out from the instances when it's pulling the bundled application from S3 and when communicating with code deploy about deployment statuses and lifecycle stages for the hooks. The role created for code deploy is to enable communication with all of the resources that code deploy service might need to communicate with. There is a default role in the IAM pre-configured permission templates for code deploy. It includes the ability to read resource tags, communicate with scaling, load balancing, and monitoring services, and to send messages through Amazon Simple Notification Service. The only permissions I'm actually using for this demo are the ability to read tags. But if you decide you need more or less permissions, you can always modify the pre-configured template to create permissions unique to your use case. After the permissions, I created an S3 bucket to be used as my repository, and then I launched my EC2 instance. Because I'm connecting to the instance directly, I made sure to launch into a public subnet in my VPC and with a public IP address. Once the instance was launched, I needed to make sure that the code deploy agent was installed and running. As I stated in the earlier section on code deploy, I could have done this through a startup script using the user data. But because I'm only working with a single instance for this demo, I didn't find it necessary. Now that the components being utilized are ready, I needed to create the app spec file and package up the revision to put into my S3 location for use. Once that is ready, I'm now ready to move on to setting up everything in code deploy. To prepare my deployment for code deploy, I now set up my application and deployment group. As review, the application setup is just the mechanism for organizing all of the deployment groups that you would have for a particular application. In the console, creating an application is just creating the first deployment group. Once it is created, you can add and remove other deployment groups as you may need. The deployment group is how you organize the fleet of instances that will be used for a particular deployment and the permissions needed for code deploy to do its work. In this case, my deployment group is just the single instance, and I'm using the default code deploy service role provided by IAM. With all of that done, I'm now ready to deploy my application to my EC2 instance. To do this in the console, I need to go into my application, which is this WordPress app here, and then select the deployment group that I'm going to use to push out my deployment. With that selected, I click Actions, and then Deploy New Revision. This will take me to my deployment configuration page. Because I got here after selecting which deployment group I would use, the application and deployment group areas are pre-filled. If I had come here without selecting a specific deployment group, or if I was doing this through the command line tools, I would need to provide this information. For the repository type, I'll make sure to use the S3 option, and then I'll input the location of the revision that I'm going to use. With that input, you can now see that the file type is automatically chosen and shows that the zip format is supported as a revision type. For the deployment configuration, I could change it from what is automatically set for the deployment group, but I'll keep it the same here. The other area we want to pay attention to here is the rollback configuration overrides. If you were deploying an update to a running application, you may want to enable a rollback to make sure that we can keep a running environment should the revision deployment fail. But because I'm just doing a first deployment, there is not an essential need to roll back to anything. After that, all I have to do is click Deploy and wait for the deployment to succeed, which will usually take at least a couple of minutes. But it depends on what all needs to be done for the specific deployment. With the deployment now done, we can go to the public address for our site and verify the application is installed and running. Well, that about does it for this round on AWS Code Deploy. We'll be getting into more depth on portions of this service later.